Hello, and thanks for joining me. Today I want to do a quick chat on the most recent book that I reread. It is called AD 381, Heretics, Pagans, and the Dawn of the Monotheistic State by Charles Freeman. This I originally read back in, I think, 2010 or 2011, so it's been 5 or 6 years. It was first published in the U.S. in 2009, but I had really enjoyed this back when I read it, back and I had always meant to reread it, and I just never had gotten around to it. So since I'm doing my month of December rereads, I decided that I definitely wanted to get this one reread, as I had been wanting to do for quite some time. So Charles Freeman wrote another book on a similar topic that I had read also somewhere in the distant past before I was doing Goodreads, so I don't know the date, but it is called The Closing of the Western Mind. The Rise of Faith and the Fall of Reason. This was published a little bit earlier, I think in like 2003 or so, 2004, something like that. So I read this a long time ago. I'm not sure when. I would like to reread it now again too, but I will not put this on my list to reread this December. Maybe it will be reread in my December reread month of 2017. But on to 381. So, what this book is about really is the year, well, not just the year 381, but the events leading up to this sort of pivotal year in the history of ideas in Europe, and then, sort of immediately, maybe like the next 100 years after that. This takes place, this is concerning the year 381, specifically in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire by this time has been divided into East and West, and the year 381, why this is sort of a pivotal year, is that the emperor at the time, Theodosius, actually created an edict. He created a law that defined the Trinity of the Catholic Church, the Christian Church. And because at the time there had been multiple ideas, there had not been there wasn't really yet a central sort of dogma for Christianity. It was still being debated and still being developed at this point. And so this year was pivotal because it was the first year that the state actually intervened to actually come down on the side of the Nicene, what's known as the Nicene version of the Trinity, which is basically ultimately what Christianity basically ended up adopting, that we know today. So, just to put it in context a little bit, at this time, though, this is the Roman Empire of the 4th century, so the 300s. It's in a kind of it's in a very pivotal point in its history, especially in the West, where it has become destabilized, and it would actually go on then to cease to exist in 476, so about 100 years after this 381. The Roman Empire in the West was no more. It did continue on in the East for another 1,000 years, known at that point as the Byzantine Empire. But what the intellectual climate of the time it was very dynamic. So there was a lot of ideas because paganism still existed at this time, was still very widespread. Earlier in the 300s is when Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, converted to Christianity. That was sort of pivotal in making Christianity sort of an established religion of the empire, but it didn't. The empire, the Roman government itself, the emperors had never really intervened in the theology until really at this point in 381, which wasn't a major step, but it was enough that it later got built upon with later church councils, as well as through the work of Saint Augustine, who was a great theologian of the time. Later on, the next century. But anyway, the part of the experience, the cool part of me reading it was this mix of ideas. It was very diverse, very multicultural. Christianity itself, there was differences from the kind of the Eastern Mediterranean had this exposure to Greece and Greek ideas and Greek philosophies and sort of the Greek ways of knowing, the Greek ways of exploring, which was through discourse. It was through argument and discourse, and then people would come to a consensus based on this. The Western part of the empire did not have this tradition quite as strongly, but in the East, it was very dynamic environment for Christianity, particularly at this point in time, because it's borrowing a lot of philosophy from the pagan classical world, but paganism actually continued to exist as well, but it all sort of comes crashing down actually fairly quickly after 381. Their paganism ultimately sacrifices, part of the pagan rituals for most of the pagan sort of cults involved animal sacrifices, and that's one thing that got outlawed. And then actually paganism got persecuted and shrines were destroyed, and this was all sort of done with the blessing of the Roman government and the Roman emperors. The many temples and shrines, especially in the eastern part of the empire, were destroyed. In the West, in some cases, the shrines and whatnot were converted into Christian shrines. One kind of interesting kind of takeaway that I remember from the book was that this thing that we have, in Christian culture of lighting candles for things that came from paganism. People would have these little family altars to their household gods and to their various gods, and they would light lamps and light candles for that. They became outlawed to do this for the pagan portion of it, but it was that tradition then was carried over into the Western Christian tradition of lighting candles in church. So I thought that was kind of cool. Anyway, there was over this course of the 4th century and the 5th century, paganism was suppressed and ultimately disappeared. I just jotted down when I was writing, the last time the Olympic Games was held was in the year 393. So it became very dangerous for pagans to practice any of their pagan sort of some of these traditions had been were thousands of years old. Plato's Academy closed around this time, slightly later, I think. It had been in existence for 900 years, and it closed. So slowly, the idea of questioning became not politically correct, we might say today. It became not allowed. It actually became illegal. It became very dangerous because the church and the government could just declare people to be heretics because it was a dogma that they didn't want, that they wanted to suppress. And so this free flow of ideas that had existed before in Rome really just ceased to exist and wouldn't exist again until the coming of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment about in the year 15, around 1500, when questioning and sort of rediscovery of some of this ancient knowledge began again, because I think the other cool thing that was brought up in this book was the libraries and the knowledge. Even though they didn't have printing presses yet, the books and the codices, they were called, and the scrolls, they're also scrolls, but they were moving to these codices, which were bound kind of books, what we might call books today. How many of them there were, and they were exchanged over the whole Mediterranean area, the whole Roman area, from east to west and north to south. But then in the centuries following this year 381, that ceased because this knowledge became dangerous. St. Augustine actually says in his, I think in some of his work, that if it doesn't pertain to Christianity, it's not worth knowing. And so that idea took hold and really stuck then for the next 1,000 years. So, I thought that was real cool because the takeaway I had of that was just how this can happen. Like, how that a society can have this free flow of ideas, and then something come along where just a course of events. I don't, from reading this, I didn't get the idea that the Christian theologians of the time started out being so. They weren't really this rigid to begin with, but events, led one after to another, where sort of the doors closed to any sort of further inquiry, and ultimately that went on to extend to everything, it not just theological issues, but scientific and humanitarian and literature and really any sort of thing. Then ultimately got affected by this. By this sort of trend. So, I really like this idea. I like this history of ideas like this. It was a great sort of, I'm really glad that I readdressed this because it really was a great sort of experience to go back in time like this to the year 381 where things were recognizable, to me as a 21st century person, but yet very different. And it's before a lot of what I inherited as a cultural Christian growing up in a society that's dominated by Christianity, where a lot of the ideas of Christianity, are just default, that people don't necessarily think about them. But the whole idea of the Trinity and the nature of Jesus and the nature of God and really the nature of hell and sin, all this. At this point in time, it had all not been settled yet. It was still being discussed in these centuries leading up to from the beginning of Christianity all the way up till past this year 381. But this year 381 was really pivotal in sort of the history of ideas, and kind of not in a good way. So I think I'll stop with that. I am really glad that I readdressed and reread this book and engaged with it again. I found it very fresh because it had been so long since I read it. It was all kind of new to me again. So I'm really glad that I did, and I'm really glad that I'm really enjoying this December rereads month. So I'm going to make this a new tradition. But I actually am still hoping to get a couple more books reread in the month of December. So stay tuned for those chats. They will be coming up soon. Take care.